Okay, hello, hello, hello. I know you're all still getting your activity materials. I hope you're all excited for whatever that means. Hi. How are you feeling? How's everyone feeling at GCAP? Feeling good? Feeling good? Cool. I don't know how I feel, to be honest. Or at least lately, things have been a little bit up and down. I'm happy to be here at GCAP, and I'm really honoured to have the opportunity to speak with you all. But I think it has been a bit of a tough year in a few ways. And I don't think that it's just me. So can you raise your hand if it's been a bit of a challenging year for you? Woo! Yeah, it does feel that way. Does anyone feel comfortable just shouting out why? I was going to say in this room full of strangers, but this is the games industry, we all totally know each other. So can you shout out, like, why has it been challenging for you?
Overwork.
Overwork. What else?
Unemployment.
Unemployment.
Expectations.
Expectations. Ooh, expectations. Nice. Okay, fun. A lot of things have changed for me, but just quickly, who am I before we get into our feelings? I'm McLean. I'm a product manager at Wargaming Sydney. So if you don't know, Wargaming Sydney is one of Australia's largest and longest established video game studios, founded as Microforte Big World in 1995. It got acquired by Wargaming following the massive success of World of Tanks. Today it is home to 100 developers working on diverse projects from cutting-edge tech to AAA games production, which is what I do. I'm also the other logo. I'm the CEO of The Working Lunch, so we're a social enterprise creating opportunities for underrepresented people in games, be that through our mentorship program that this year we ran in Sydney, Brisbane, Wellington and Adelaide, thanks to IGA. And also this weekend we're doing our next exhibit, which is a showcase of games made by underrepresented developers. So if you're at PAX, come check us out in the main concourse, it's going to be great. So moving on from that, I have found it to be a bit of a challenging year in games. The discourse has been a bit heavy, and some pretty big things have changed or have started to change. To try to make some sense of it all, I did the most obnoxious producer thing I could possibly do, and I put out a survey. I asked a few questions. So in the last year, what has changed for you in games, and how did that change affect you? What is your biggest, scariest unknown about the next few years in games? And what do you think should change about the games industry? So I asked these questions and more than 50 people responded, and then I took a look at the results, and these are the kinds of answers that I got. I'm sorry if the text is really small. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. My team hit it big with a successful product and simply didn't know how to scale up. In the last year, I've seen my hours reduced, my workload lightened, and a supporting cast built up around that position as I've voluntarily transitioned into another. We got dropped by a publisher who recently got bought out, and our studio nearly went under. As an artist, I learnt to code in C# and started work on my first solo project, now with a few contractors. This has been hugely empowering. It's an opportunity to prove myself as a game designer, as well as the ultimate test. I work in a team for my indie game, and I'm scared that my decision to take a day job will cause us to fail. I'm scared of ruining my friend's dream. I worked as a chef for 10 years before deciding to study games programming, and it's been the best life decision I've ever made. A lot of my friends and co-workers lost their job or their businesses failed. It's made me paranoid, like my imposter syndrome is real. I grew stronger as a working professional, and it came at the expense of losing people I didn't realise were damaging. New leadership, recognising my worth and lifting me up. It's been an incredible, loving shift. So you can see this is just a snapshot of a pretty broad range of experiences. Talking to people about change in this space, you can imagine pretty broadly the kind of topics that came up. So layoffs, crunch culture, harassment, money and dreams, all those kinds of things. So I just want to say right now, this is not a sad talk. We're going to be fine. I've been to a lot of talks this year about topics like this, where I left feeling deflated or overwhelmed, but this is not our goal today, okay? I think as an industry lately, we've gotten quite good at identifying problems and articulating them very well. I think those conversations are important. I think they're vitally important. I think we need to look to our industry mentors for guidance, and almost more importantly, we need to look to each other for support. And even more importantly than that, I think we need to look inwardly to ourselves to critique, to grow, and to evolve, and to ultimately make the industry better. I think two-way conversation and just sharing where we're at on this stuff is really important. I think it's important to do that face-to-face and not as avatars or as companies. I think it's so important that I'm going to make you all participate in doing just that today. So we've got maybe 40 minutes and there are maybe 50 people in this room. I could be totally wrong. But with those many brains and this amount of time, I genuinely do feel like we can change the world. And as a producer, I feel we can change the world through Post-it notes. I really do believe that. I do believe that's possible. So throughout this session, you laugh, but it's true. Throughout this session, when I have a question for you, I'll show you a slide like this one. And sometimes there will be multiple questions, so feel free to pick your favorite. And I want you to try and answer them if you feel compelled to. And there are volunteers. Can you stand up if you're the person who's going to be doing that? There are a few people floating around who will collect your Post-it notes. We're going to work together. We're going to have a system. You're going to pass them towards the middle. These people will come and collect them and they will stick them on the wall. At the end, if we have time, we might read some of them out, but if we don't, we're going to document them, we're going to put them online, and we're going to release them as your wonderful ideas as part of showcasing the results of this survey and this research. Cool. So, does everyone have Post-it notes and pens?
I think some people maybe missed out, so if you have missed out, just share with the people if you've got more.
Just democratize it.
Just be kind to each other.
Okay, so you can go to any number of talks during GCAP where very experienced and very wise people will give you their thoughts on very pressing matters that we're facing today, and you should go to those talks. When I pitched this talk, my intention was to take the concerns and the themes that came out of the survey and take them to industry leaders and big game smart people and get their takes on it. And then I realized that that is just Gabe's Twitter, the GCAP talk. It's a bad idea. So I was in a difficult situation. Because I don't know about you, but I'm not getting the answers to the questions that sit in my soul from Twitter. So I decided to take a slightly different approach. So what I did was I compiled all of the responses and I analysed them very unscientifically to find the patterns and the through lines that emerged. And even though this was not scientific, I did try to be very thorough. And so I want to point out that I did omit some topics because I felt that they could very easily take up an hour on their own. And then after doing some research, I also realised that there are already GCAP talks about those things. So coming up after my talk, you should attend these sessions. What unionism adds to your workplace, which is at 2 p.m. today. Who owns what? How to protect your game's IP, also at 2 p.m. today, so make your choice. State agency games funding tomorrow at 11, and disability and game development tomorrow at 12. So aside from those topics, I was able to group some themes and thoughts that emerged into 4 buckets. Control, the Spotify problem, I love when everyone reads it just in time, justice and accountability, and ourselves and our community. All of these topics I think we do a very okay job of talking about. So instead of taking my questions to games people, I took them to spooky people outside of games, outside of our bubble. Video games is a really young industry. We have a considerable amount to learn from people who have navigated change over far vaster tracts of time and at far higher stakes than we have. There are lenses through which we can view our problems that will not naturally arise through discourse with ourselves. So for this talk, I took the themes and questions that arose from this survey and I spoke to these people. I'm going to run you through them real quick, but I'll give you some more information about them later. So Dr. Janara Gareng, who is the founder and national convener of the Foundation for Indigenous Recovery and Development Australia. Alison Whitaker, who is a Gomeroi poet, essayist and legal scholar. Alison is a research fellow at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research. Dr. Sophie Lewis, who is a climate scientist at UNSW Canberra and the ACT Scientist of the Year. Michelle Rowland, who is the member for Greenway and the Shadow Minister for Communications. Katherine Cross, who is a sociologist and games and social critic. She's the only person who I spoke to who does have a foot in the games industry, but I'm going to explain why it was important to talk to her later. Kevin Dausch, who is the founder of Big Scary Monsters Records, an independent punk rock record label in the UK. Genevieve Clay-Smith, who's a film director, co-owner of Taste Creative and co-founder of Bus Stop Films, which is a charity dedicated to providing people from marginalised communities the opportunity to be part of filmmaking. And Josephine Rosenberg-Clark, the head of editorial at Pedestrian, formerly the editor of Dolly magazine. As you can imagine, this group of people brought a wealth of wisdom and different perspectives on the issues facing us, the issues on our minds as an industry. And I'm going to share what I found with you. I'm also going to share my perspective, but my intention is not to speak at you. It's to drive conversation, plant seeds in your mind to think about these perspectives that will hopefully drive good chats that you'll have throughout the week. So let's start with control. So when I say control, I'm talking about survey responses like these examples. So how can I plan my long-term future when this industry seems to have a new seismic change every other month? My scariest unknown is if I'll ever be able to make the creative impact I want to when so much is out of my hands. I want to know whether spreading awareness about diversity will finally catch on. The industry seems to be heading in a direction that I don't agree with. So can you raise your hand if any of these comments resonate with you in any way? Yeah. So just to get the last few people, can you also raise your hand if you feel like you have total control over your destiny in the games industry? Yeah, cool. So a few things that felt like institutions have changed in games in this last year or so. Be that at a larger scale, something like Steam's monopoly being challenged, or more locally, a studio like Defiant closing their doors. When our foundations shift, this sense of losing control is particularly thick in the air. So when I thought about who to turn to for this, I wondered who would know what it's like to operate in a space that you care so much about, but is so outside of your control. So how about a climate scientist? So I spoke to Dr. Sophie Lewis about control, and I apologise in advance for comparing the heat death of the universe to games industry problems. It's just how the metaphor worked out, and let's just not interrogate it. So Sophie said, as individuals, we feel this space is outside of our control. People feel disempowered about climate change. But collectively, so much of the severity of the impacts of climate change are within our control. If we'd acted meaningfully on climate change years ago, or if we were implementing adequate adaptation strategies now, we'd have some control over the impacts of climate on our lives as individuals. We have control, but we've implemented it in a way that benefits some, but not others. Some now, and some later. When I asked Sophie what it's like to operate in a space so beyond your control, she said how people react to feeling disempowered is entirely an individual response, from denial or willful ignorance through to complete embrace of low-carbon living. I guess it's also partly why we're seeing things like flyless movements or school strikes, which bridge the space between individual and collective. I asked Sophie how she continues on in a space like that, and she said she feels like she gains so much balance from younger people, kids and young adults, who she sees as far more empowered and more capable than her. I reckon there's a reason that she's Scientist of the Year. She's pretty smart. I also spoke to Michelle Rowland, the Shadow Minister for Communications. Michelle, obviously, as a Member of Parliament, has a unique vantage point on what it means to be empowered to make change. But I was interested in how she thought that people not in her position could do that. So Michelle said, as federal member, I'm called to speak about issues that matter most to my community, regardless of how uncomfortable or confronting those issues may be. She also believes that having a platform is not essential to achieving change. Michelle gave two examples from her community that she felt embodied making change without a platform. So one of them was Grace's Place, which is a world-first residential trauma recovery centre for children affected by homicide, which the sister of Anita Cobby, who was murdered in 1986, is the patron. She also spoke about the Harmon Foundation, which provides crisis relief, food hampers and 24/7 support for women fleeing family violence. Michelle says the people who run these efforts are ordinary people motivated by their own experiences or a need to make a difference, who can do extraordinary things. So when Dr. Lewis says acting meaningfully early can give us control over big things, I wonder how that relates to games. What does it mean to act meaningfully in games? Does it mean taking the kinds of extraordinary acts that Michelle is talking about, or does it mean something else? So to me, acting meaningfully is taking values-based action, especially when it's inconvenient, to practically build the future that you want to live in. One example that comes to mind very recently, in the last few days after Kickstarter's leadership came out with an anti-union stance, the new Australian games company Summerfall Studios came out with a statement that they had moved their recently announced crowdfunding campaign, their basis of their announcement of their entirely new business, from Kickstarter to Fig. Whether or not you agree with that action, these are people taking the inconvenient path in order to not directly or indirectly support action that's contrary to their values. And that, to me, is a meaningful act. Other meaningful acts might be if diversity is core to your beliefs, building a growth strategy for your company that supports slower recruitment in order to find diverse talent, or instituting quotas that ensure a diverse workforce. So my question to you, get your pens out. What is one meaningful act that you could take to build the future that you want to see? And if that's too hard, or if you don't see yourself as empowered or in a position to act meaningfully, and that's fair enough, some of you might not be. Following on from what Sophie said about looking to young people who are empowered to make change with regards to the climate, who do you see as empowered to drive meaningful change in games? So I'm going to give you a minute to write your answers, and then they'll be collected. And I'm going to have some water.
There are some people at the back that don't have any post-it notes, so if you have any extras, like if you feel like you've got a big chunk, can you just split it a little bit and, yeah.
Lots of furrowed brows. Off to a strong start. Okay. So, when Dr. Lewis talked about the school strikes for climate and their ability to empower people by bridging the space between the individual and the collective, I wondered what that looks like. Especially for people who answered the survey along the lines of, I don't like the direction the industry is headed. When I read further, one of those responders spoke about a feeling of helplessness as an independent developer looking down the barrel of game streaming services. And this is a trend that emerged pretty strongly throughout the survey responses, so much so that I had to name a whole category after it, the Spotify problem. So lots of answers along these lines. Market shifts, the rise of streaming service makes me acutely aware of the value of my connections to leverage, connections in real life through recommendations, and whatever fancy secret societies I'm missing out on. Streaming, will we get the Spotify model or the Netflix model? And Stadia, the resulting homogenization from a potential Spotify-style licensing model. So you wouldn't have needed to be a psychic to predict that this theme would come out of this survey. There's a lot of industry chatter about what streaming means for our future. To gain some insights about this, I wanted to go to two other industries who have experienced similar kind of upheaval. So that's music and the media. So I spoke to Kevin Dausch, who founded punk rock music label Big Scary Monsters when he was 18 years old and carried it through to today. You might know them from releases by bands like American Football, La Dispute, The Get Up Kids, Delta Sleep, and many more, and they also run their own music festivals in London. Speaking to Kevin, he told me we've seen unbelievable change. In the early days, the internet was still fairly new, but I remember some labels were already desperately fighting back against the digital revolution. He said perhaps it was an age thing, but I was happily posting as many free clips of my songs as my dial-up connection would allow, as I always believed hearing the music was the best possible ad for it. However, lots of other labels came out with statements saying they would never, ever do this. After that, of course, as broadband internet kicked in, we went through Napster, Shazam, MySpace, and so many more portals for the distribution of digital music. Again, some embraced it, others fought back. I think the most stark of those were the major labels who came out with all guns blazing and tried suing fans for illegally downloading their music. That's a period no one's going to look back on with much pride. Kevin said in terms of lessons to learn, the first and foremost has to be don't sue your fans. And he said, and this isn't a whole lot of help, but embracing what's inevitably happening is ultimately the best path. The media landscape has also undergone complete transformation. As readers' habits change and print media's relevance is challenged, I spoke to Josie Rosenberg-Clark about her experience. Josie said, for me, working in the media in Australia for 10 years, I've seen a hell of a lot of change, especially because the bulk of my career has been spent battling in the print media sector. I always found that the thing I clung to in times of flux was the entire reason I was there in the first place, the reader. That's who we're creating content for. So if you remove all of the external noise and the company upheaval, it really helped to have that anchor point. I think this really applied when I became editor of Dolly magazine, which is a sentence I've always wanted to say out loud. And Bauer Media, our publisher, cut it from a monthly to a bi-monthly title. They had to redesign the magazine, make a poster magazine and a yearbook, but also gave them a team of 4, including Josie, to pull it off. Myself and the team went back to basics. What do teens care about? What makes them tick? How do they want to be spoken to? It made it so much easier to create a mag again from scratch, knowing who we were doing it for and why we were there. It's hard to find that drive otherwise, especially when your very job feels so vulnerable. An interesting trend from both of these interviews was about focusing on your audience, their needs and their wants. I think this is a particularly interesting topic in games. As developers, our relationship with games consumers can be complicated. So who do we make games for? Very eager to answer questions. Your time will come. Does our complex relationship with gamer culture impact on our ability to feel anchored by our work? To me, to borrow a phrase from one of the survey responders, capital G gamers, who we've come to associate with some bad things, are not really who I make games for. And I think a lot of the answers to the survey questions reflected a similar feeling. This doesn't mean that I make games not for gamers, nor does it mean that I don't have a respect and an appreciation for the people who play the games that I work on. I absolutely do, but it's a really hard question, and I'm quite envious of Josie's ability to feel anchored by conjuring the image of the reader. The other connection between what Kevin and Josie said was this idea of embracing change. What does embracing changing business models in games look like? Going back to something that Dr. Lewis said about control, we have control, but we've implemented it in a way that benefits some but not others. To me, embracing this change and molding it into something that gives us the control that we want. It's about making sure we don't rebuild the same biases into new systems. This means, for example, we may have a responsibility to share secret knowledge. One of the responses that I quoted earlier mentioned this sense of anxiety of missing out on opportunities or information shared in secret societies, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But first, question time. Who do you make games for? And if you're able to answer that enormous question, you can go on to the second one. When given the opportunity, how can we stop ourselves from rebuilding broken systems? I'll let you have a think. All right. That should be enough time to answer that, right? I'm going to move on, but feel free to keep writing your answers and handing them to the volunteers. Now, so avoiding rebuilding old biases, not experiencing seismic change and then choosing to rebuild the same broken system in a new way. Ensuring this doesn't happen is also about accountability, and it's about justice. Two big themes that also emerged from the survey. So answers like this: what I'd like to see change is checks and balances for the people who make decisions that impact the rest of us. What I'd like to see change is more accountability from people in power. Our industry needs to take a stronger stance on harassment and abuse of all kinds. Everyone should have an equal shot at their dream job. Justice and accountability are consistently hot topics. And this year has seen these conversations continue. You know, these conversations have been about so many things, whether it be about accountability for companies that operate unethically, or for individuals accused of abuse or harassment. Justice for laid-off workers, or simply fairness for underrepresented people in the workplace who consistently have to work harder, to jump higher, to make it through hoops that do not exist for other people. I could think of no one better to talk about justice than Alison Whitaker. I could not believe she replied to my email. Alison Whitaker is a Gomeroi poet and legal researcher from the floodplains of Gunnedah in New South Wales. Between 2017 and 2018, she was a Fulbright scholar at Harvard Law School, where she was named the Dean's Scholar in Race, Gender and Criminal Law. Her second book, Black Work, was released last year. Prior to this, Alison worked at UTS Law, the Gendered Violence Research Network, and received a Black and White Fellowship from the State Library of Queensland. She's awesome. When I spoke to Alison about the conversations we're having in games right now about justice and accountability, she said, "I'm reminded a bit of the recent discourse around community accountability models and how they can amplify stuff we might describe as unjust. We can't always think of justice as conflict, as individualistic wrong and retribution. It's about giving a community power to exert control towards a more just fate. To that end, accountability is important because it gives us transparency, and from there, a sense of where to change. But it can't only be talk. Only enhancing our language to disguise systemic wrongs as something that can be fixed by individual virtue. It requires messy consensus building among marginalised groups, deference to those marginalised groups, and clearly thought out visions of where we want to go. It also requires being wrong a lot. Nothing we're going to build in this generation is going to be right, but working towards a time where these mechanisms might be right. Building knowledge transition and knowledge translation and knowledge transmission in. And in ways, Alison says, it requires a lot less effort than we may think from everyone involved. Probably the biggest challenge is resourcing justice, getting to truth-telling, and to figuring out what everyone needs to restore community balance and control. It takes a lot of money for independent workers, financial and social support. She says the models are more or less there, where they just need the moolah to launch. That requires community and, in your case, industry commitment, not just to displaying the credit for justice making, but to take the risk on resourcing something that ultimately implicates them. Like, when you're right, you're right. She's so smart. I often think when we hear things about justice, they can seem a lot bigger than us, and they can seem sort of too deep for games and for our bubble where, you know, we all happily just sort of make entertainment and make toys, and this doesn't really affect us. So in this instance, I thought it was really important to speak to someone with industry context. Context about accountability in our space, to see how those thought patterns played out for somebody who also has lived experience of being an underrepresented person in games. So Katherine Cross is a sociologist, a trans feminist, and a gaming critic. I spoke with Katherine about accountability, and she provided me with a diagram, which I did not expect, but I was thrilled. So this is Rubenstein's model for accountability in an unequal world, which is just fun to say, but sad to think about. Katherine explained to me that there is sort of no standard definition of accountability in sociology or sort of in any other discipline, but there are some trends, and this model, made by Jennifer Rubenstein, a political scientist at the University of Virginia, it outlines a model for accountability in an unequal world that may apply to games. So this model outlines how standards, information, and sanction are important. So this is the example that's included in the footnote of this diagram. The claim that George should be more accountable can reasonably be taken to mean that A, George should be held to higher standards, B, George should provide more information about his past activities, or C, George should be sanctioned more strongly for failing to meet the standards. The issue with this model is that less powerful people, when transgressed against, do not have the ability to sanction the powerful in any meaningful way. Rubinstein says that we should have surrogate accountability holders to act on behalf of those who are wronged in the way that we have NGOs acting as surrogates for impoverished people. Speaking from Katherine's perspective, accountability is a buzzword that is verging on meaninglessness, which was not a fun way to start that conversation, but it doesn't have to be. Katherine says accountability is often individualized as a phenomenon. It means one person saying sorry or getting fired, and while that can be important, it often does little to stem the tide of social problems. Katherine says the key question is, do the accountability holders have the power to change standards, change the social structure they're operating in, such that they not only punish one bad actor, but prevent others from doing the same thing? Accountability has to be both punitive and restorative, sanctioning a transgressor and changing the situation to prevent other transgressors from harming people. And it's the second part Katherine says we're failing at badly. Katherine also thinks that some of the problem also lies in our community's taste for viral dunks. Too many of us mistake a Twitter dogpile for accountability. Further, accountability shouldn't just mean holding bad people accountable for wrongdoing. It should mean being accountable for each other. If you treat accountability as an individual matter, we will continue to circle the drain on this issue. So it's interesting to me where the intersections are between what Alison said and what Katherine said. To me, the key message from both of them is that justice and accountability go well beyond the actions of individuals and the consequences that those individuals face. So how do we steer the change in our community accountability towards a more just future? How we resource justice is obviously a huge conversation in games globally right now. Be it through unionization, be it through everything that happened with regards to allegations of abuse online, has gone on to stir discussions about how we approach community accountability. How do we build paths for redemption for those who have done wrong, while still being accountable, most importantly, for each other, and for those who have been wronged and deserve support and care, and to be able to continue their careers? To me, I think there's a big roadblock culturally that Alison pointed out. She said it requires being wrong a lot. Nothing we're going to build in this generation is going to be right, but working towards a time where these mechanisms might be right. As a producer, I can definitely advocate for incrementally improving our process and building channels for honest communication that are strong enough to survive mistakes and strong enough to survive failure. So I just have one question for you. How can we make space for each other to get it wrong? So this could be in your workplace, it could be in your city, in your communities, your Facebook groups, your Slack channels, your Discord channels, wherever you operate with your games community. And getting it wrong can be everything from a professional mistake with a task, it could be undermining trust in a relationship, it could be a fumbled diversity initiative, it could be a poorly worded social media post. How do we give each other more chances to learn and grow together? Seeing some heads up, so I'll keep going. A key part of this to me is one way or another, it's about healing our communities. It's about healing ourselves. How we treat our communities in ourselves is the last survey theme that I want to talk about today. So these examples are just sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the results I got about community, but I think they touch on some underlying themes. What's changed for me is I don't know my place within the industry and the games community. My scariest unknown is that games will not find experienced industry champions to build and teach the future, that so many will try and reach a ceiling. What I'd like to change is developers with platforms need to set a better example for how to take care of yourself. Glamorizing long hours and suffering for our art is not good for us. There are so many talented game developers that have never been heard. that we as an industry would benefit from hearing from. I know that these are a bit of a bummer, but we're going somewhere with it. So let's talk about overworking. Dr. Janara Gureng has been an academic lecturer and researcher at 5 Australian universities, the Foundation Director of Aboriginal Education at Charles Sturt University, and the Director of the Centre for Aboriginal Education at the University of Melbourne. Janara has delivered keynote speeches and workshops on recovery and healing at the International Indigenous Healing Our Spirits Worldwide Conference and the Soul Conference in Minnesota, and at Indigenous International Education Conferences in her research field of Indigenous Studies, Family Systems, Recovery and Leadership. Janara carries the traditions of her clan through medicine practice, being a songwoman, and teaching Aboriginal law and spirituality to people throughout the world. She also wanted me to tell you that the wisdom that she shared with me to share with you was passed to her by her elders and by her ancestors. When we talk about crunch, sorry for that sharp turn, we often talk about it as something unique to the games industry. But when I spoke with Janara, I was really struck by how easily I was able to apply what she said to my own experience. Janara said, one has to be committed to the inner healing journey, as it has an impact on the outer healing journey of all of our society and our planet. Once committed, the determination to do what is necessary means I follow my inner intuition that tells me to give time to my healing journey. Work is not the everything of life. The self, the soul, and the spirit is. So it requires my first attention to give to the self that I'm strong and well emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Janara told me about the 3 laws of respect that she lives by. The first law is to respect and honour the self. And she says, I have to do this one first. This keeps me healthy, strong, functional, and balanced. The second is to respect and honour others, and then respect and honour the earth, our mother, because it gives us what we need to survive. Janara said, in this way, my life is a healing journey, and my work is part of that, but second to the most important thing, my spirit and myself. Work is not the everything of life. We know this in theory. So if you're not aware of Checkpoint, they're a charity that produces mental health resources for gamers and the games industry. They have really good self-care resources that are free. I use them at my company, Working Lunch. You should use them too. You can get them on checkpointorg.com. So I'm going to let them do the work of telling you what self-care is, and I'm going to move on. But beyond self-care and healthier work habits, what does that statement mean? Work is not the everything of life. Coming back to the idea of moving away from an individualistic view of these issues, how does this way of thinking impact on how we see each other and how we see our community? If our work and our personal achievements are not the everything of life, how does that change the way we relate to each other? And what impact does that have on the community that we end up with? Genevieve Clay-Smith is an Australian film director. She's an advocate of inclusive filmmaking, helping to ensure that the film industry is accessible for all. And I spoke with Genevieve about work not being the everything of life. Genevieve said, when I achieve a goal and I climb to the top of the ladder with an opportunity, I don't pull the ladder up, look down, and watch others struggle to get up to be with me. I keep the ladder down and extend my hand. So I actively find ways to mentor other women. I put women forward for awards. I find ways to employ women, and I produce and finance films of other female directors. Lifting others up is quite literal for me. When I asked Genevieve why do that? Why not just continue on and be a successful individual and not invest all of this energy in constantly having to help others? She said, because you can never achieve your goals alone. She said this is why men do so well. They all support each other and hire each other. It's why they've dominated the promotions, executive roles, and opportunities for so long. If I want opportunities in the future, I need the women I've supported. You might think it's easy to think of yourself, but as you progress, you'll find that being a silo isn't very productive and doesn't get you very far. I like how Genevieve framed kindness as a sort of self-preservation. I'm hoping that it'll convert some of the cynics in the room. So I think there's good news in this. I think of all the big puzzles to solve, we are further along in conversation when it comes to taking care of ourselves and taking care of our communities, but we do have some work to do. So from the survey responses, there were some particularly candid anonymous replies that spoke to this feeling of not having a place or not having a voice or feeling overlooked. And I think that this is not unrelated to our small pool of jobs, because our work does give us a sense of purpose, but it also grants us status. That is unavoidable human grossness, but that doesn't have to be how we behave. From the other themes we've explored today, we know that real change and real justice comes from thinking collectively, not individualistically. So thinking for the good of the whole industry, I want everyone who comes to Games Week and comes to the games industry in Australia to feel a sense of potential and a sense of connectedness, so that they can feel empowered to act meaningfully, to contribute to a stronger, better future. When we treat people a certain way because of their status or their lack thereof, when we create in-groups, build walls and safeguard secret knowledge, we contribute to making each other feel lost or feel out of place, of less value. The good news is we are all individually empowered to act meaningfully to change that today. So if everybody in this room left with a mission to leave the ladder down and extend your hand, to demonstrate that work is not the everything of life, it would send ripples of real change throughout the community here at Games Week to people who will fly back throughout Australia and New Zealand and further and take that to their communities. So my question to you is, what can you do at GCAP to leave the ladder down and help others? And if you answer that one super quickly, I've got another one too. What can we do in our workplaces and our communities to reinforce that work is not the everything of life? This is the last question, so I'm going to give you a little bit more time to catch up if you didn't get to get all your ideas out. Okay. So doing some quick math, if there's like 50 people in here, and if you all extended your hand and left the ladder down for 10 people during Games Week, which is not that many, like over 5 days, 2 a day, that's 500. That's 500 helping hands, and 500 helping hands can do a lot of good, and that's real power. So I know I said that Genevieve was the last inspiring person I'd be quoting for this talk, but I do have one more. This person and this quote, it brings me a lot of comfort. Because as I said at the start of this talk, it's been a challenging year. It's been easy to feel like it's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sorry, opposite way. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's been a long talk. We're looking at a lot of work that needs to be done for us to build the future that we want to live and work in. If we want control, we must act meaningfully. The Spotify problem and other potentially massive market shifts are not going away because we're afraid of them. Let's focus on adapting and figure out why we do this, who we do this for. Let's find our anchors. Justice and accountability is not an individual phenomenon. It requires resources, time, and tolerance of a lot of mistakes to pull it off. We serve ourselves by supporting our community. With everything that we weather together, every puzzle that we solve, every meaningful act, every mistake, we get better. So this last quote really embodies that for me. I've loved and I've lost, but that's not what I see. Look what I got. Look what you taught me. And for that I say, thank you next. Thanks.